Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21 is the key source for end-time details. Here we find Jesus standing before the temple buildings, and he told his disciples the temple would be torn down and not one stone would be left standing. The disciples, caught a bit off guard, asked for some details. Now, if you're one of those disciples, wouldn't you ask him to clarify? Like, when would this be? What would be the sign of his return, the end of the age? Jesus answered with specific and abundant details, not just to provide them an answer, but to warn them exactly when to leave so that they could escape the coming tribulation that all would suffer if they did not get out in time. They would also be ready for his return. Now, if you were one of those disciples, you would be paying close attention, I think. However, he was speaking to the disciples. It was all about them. And Jesus' answer flows like water off a duck's back. Jesus' answer, arranged chronologically, provided all the details necessary for them to escape the coming tribulation and provide them the sign of his return. Now, the answer, in brief, has 6 parts. First, the disciples would be arrested and brought to trial. Second, the beginning of birth pains, which was false messiahs, wars, famines, and earthquakes. Third, lawlessness would increase. Fourth, in a time of great distress, Jerusalem would be laid desolate. Fifth, the sun would be darkened and the stars would fall from the sky. And sixth, the Son of Man would come in the clouds and send his angels forth to gather his elect. Now, no large time gaps separating these events are ever suggested. When you read news, do you assume there's time shifts of thousands of years embedded in the dialogue if none is suggested? Well, Jesus, speaking to his disciples, is news. Everything would be observed by them. Nothing in the dialogue suggests a time shift to a distant generation. There is no implied time shift. Any time shift is only our personal interpretation. Since we assume he has not returned, the typical interpretation assumes a time shift somewhere in the dialogue which projects the second coming sometime into our future. Personal interpretation proposing a time shift placing the end time into the distant future presents a few problems. Standing before the temple buildings, Jesus said the temple would be torn down. That temple was demolished in AD 70. Was that the temple Jesus was speaking of? If not, were the disciples simply fooled into thinking it was about them and the temple before them? If Jesus was not speaking of the temple they were looking at, then he spoke of yet another temple in the far distant future which must be first built and then demolished. This leads to the popular theory of dual fulfillment, which suggests there are 2 temples and 2 destructions. Now, would Jesus intentionally mislead his disciples on dual temples and dual destructions? Fact is, there are no time shifts implied in the dialogue. None. The warning was for the disciples and believers who would listen. It was for their benefit to escape the coming tribulation and be prepared for his return. Jesus said their generation would not pass away until all those things took place. For those who doubt who this generation is, they need only look at my PDF listing most references to the end time in their own generation. From this list, author's intent becomes obvious. On the other hand, an end time in the far distant future is nowhere to be found in the New Testament. A time shift in this dialogue is strictly personal interpretation. It is not biblical. A wiser choice would be to compare Jesus' warning to his disciples to known history. This is what I have done in my book, Prophecy Paradox, the Case for a First Century End Time. Evidence for a first century end time is remarkable.